We are live. I think we were having a bit too much of a good time while waiting for the counter to count down to zero. Good afternoon. My name is Bassam Haddad. I'm the founding director of the Middle East and Islamic Studies program at George Mason University and an associate professor at the Shah School, also at George Mason University. And I have no idea why I'm talking so fast. I think it's all the coffee and so on. In all cases, I am extremely excited to have this event today. We all are. This is a long-awaited book talk or book conversation by Maya Mikdashi addressing her new book, which just was released relatively recently from Stanford University Press, titled Sectarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon. And we have been trying to plan this for quite some time, and finally we were able to host Maya with us here at this podcast, which actually is streaming for the first time this past few days. We've been streaming simultaneously to YouTube, Facebook, as well as Twitter. And my co-host, before I introduce our main speaker, my co-host is Nadia Sbaiti, who is many things, of course, and certainly one of them is that Nadia and I have been friends for a very long time. And I am very excited to be doing this with her. It will be very strange for us to be talking about anything without laughing, but we will try to do this as much as possible today. Nadia Sbaiti is currently visiting faculty in the Department of History at Georgetown University in Qatar. She is a co-founder and co-editor of Jadaliya. She is also many other things, has a lot of publications, and she, for some reason, asked me not to dwell on her bio. So I will stop here and ask her how you're doing. Kifik, Nadia?
I'm good, Niha. It's great to be here with you, Bassam, and especially celebrating Maya's book. So
Absolutely.
I can't wait to get started.
Absolutely, and the way you answered made me realize how frantic my speed is in talking. So I will slow down, and I will become more of an academic presenter. So at this point, let me just say also that this event is co-sponsored by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, the Shah School, the Arabic Studies Institute, and the Abu Sulaiman Center for Global Islamic Studies. And we are here to welcome Professor Maya Mikdashi. Kifik, Maya?
Alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah. Okay, that's awesome.
An appropriate
Maya,
sentence given the book.
I will actually say a few words about Maya. Maya Mikdashi, besides being a longtime friend as well, she was also my former student in the late 1990s at Georgetown University, and was also a member.
Decade.
Sorry?
Wrong decade. Late 2000s. True, late 1990s.
Late 2000s?
Early 2000s, mid 2000s.
Late 1990s, early 2000s, true. And then a couple of years after, she was actually one of the co-directors of the film with myself, Sinan Antoun, Adam Shapiro, and Suzy Salami, titled About Baghdad, when we we went on vacation to Iraq right after the invasion, directly after the invasion of Iraq by the US in summer 2003. And we made what is arguably the first film that was produced and released and won lots of prizes worldwide on the situation in Iraq, titled again About Baghdad. And we went on to make several other films together, documentaries. But at this point, Maya has an entirely different bio, and I'll read it because it's chock full of nuts, as they say. Maya is an associate professor in the Department of Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Rutgers University. Her first book, Sextarianism, Sovereignty, Secularism, and the State in Lebanon, out of SUP, Stanford University Press, this year, 2022, theorizes the relationships between sexual difference and political difference, the religious and the secular, and law, bureaucracy, and biopower. Her work is grounded in ethnographic and archival research and has been translated into Arabic, Turkish, French, Spanish, and German. Wow. Maya has been published in several peer-reviewed journals, including the International Journal of Middle East Studies, IJMIS, which is the flagship for the Middle East, for the field of Middle East studies, Gay and Lesbian Quarterly, Transgender Studies Quarterly, Comparative Studies of South Asia, Africa and the Middle East, the Journal of Palestine Studies, and the American Indian Culture and Research Journal. She has also been published in peer-reviewed edited volumes and in public-facing venues. She is co-founding editor of Jadaliya and is here with us to address her new book, Sextarianism. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Nadia, who will launch this conversation. Please feel free to register your questions on the Facebook feed, on Jadaliya's Facebook feed, and we will try to take as many as we can by the end of the conversation. Nadia, it's all you. Thank you both for joining, and thanks to everyone who made it for a third event this week that we have been holding live, and there will be more next week, which I'll announce a bit later. Nadia, it's all you.
Thanks, Bassam. And as I mentioned, it's really, really exciting to be here. This is, as Bassam mentioned, we've been trying to schedule this for a few months, actually, and due to our different places of residence and schedules, and the fact that there was summer and an ongoing pandemic also. It's really exciting to be here with both of you, and it's an honor, really, and a privilege to be able to be part of this conversation around Maya's book. Given how long Bassam and I have known Maya, we've also been part of some of these conversations and have been able to, have the privilege to be part of Maya's research at various stages, from the dissertation through the book. And so to say, that this is an eagerly and long-awaited book is an understatement, and I know that a lot of people out there who are listening who feel the same way, and it's definitely the case for me. So I just want to begin with a broad kind of introduction of Maya's book, and then turn to asking you, Maya, some questions that will hopefully allow you to delve into some of the specifics and to say a lot more about both the research itself and also the process through which you did some of this work. So in her book, Dr. Maya Mikdashi theorizes the relationship between sexual and political difference as a way to understand state power. She examines how sex, sexuality, and sect, say those 3 times fast, shape and are shaped by law, secularism, and sovereignty, specifically looking at the case of Lebanon. She does so through meticulous archival research, in particular in court archives or legal archives, alongside keenly sensitive ethnographic work. In so doing, Maya theorizes how political difference is entangled with religious, secular, and sexual difference by focusing specifically on regulating religious conversion, the curation of legal archives, the impact of state violence, and the paths that secular activism has taken in Lebanon. I think it's fair to say that this book, Sextarianism, is at once a deeply intimate and also a politically capacious work. And so from that, I'd like to turn, Maya, to the first question, which is a very broad question. Can you tell us what is sectarianism? And feel free to delve into that in any way you like in terms of discussing the sort of breakdown of your book chapters or whatever else, whatever other way you feel like you want to answer this question.
Thank you. It's really lovely to be here together, I just have to say. It feels really wonderful to be speaking with you about this book. And, I think a lot of times we don't think enough about how friendship is so important to our lives, but also to knowledge production. And I know that my friendship with both of you has really impacted, how I think about the world, how I write about it, and definitely this book. In fact, I think I remember very well when I first thought of the term sectarianism. I was sitting in a conference, and I heard someone say, and I had just written this piece called Sex and Sectarianism. And then I went home and I was like thinking, and I thought, sectarianism, just shove them together. And I immediately wrote Nadia an email. This was like 2015. Nadia and Shireen an email, and I said, "Oh my god, like I think I've like, what do you think of this term?" And it just had like one word in the email. So this is really like full circle, I think, um, coming together like this. So I think you've already said, Nadia, a lot about what sectarianism, how I present it in the book. I think sectarianism draws out how both sex and sexuality and the relationship between sex and sexuality, uh, structure citizenship, biopolitical citizenship, bureaucracy, and the concerns of social movements. And here, I really think that I try to kind of theorize biopolitical citizenship through this regulation that's both legal and bureaucratic and discursive, between of sex and sexuality, and sect. And this really allows me to kind of foreground heterosexuality and heteronormativity as a kind of disciplinary project that is of great concern to state power. And that's no, different in the Middle East and in Lebanon. And if you think of heterosexuality as a kind of securitized structure, it has very different gendered stakes. So, and I think this perspective, thinking through this way, allowed me to reapproach political sectarianism as a kind of system of securitization that's really wrapped around women's sexuality and questions of demographics, questions of sort of demographic anxiety and race and class, and really sort of violence. So it's really sectarianism as a term is a theorization, and here I'm just going to read a little bit from the relationship between sexual and political difference, and it suggests that erupting, producing, and kind of moving between the so-called public and private spheres are key to understanding how both the state and secularism are staged and put into operation, and imagined also, and desired in many ways. So it does emerge from, as Nadia was saying, research in Lebanon. I conducted about 2.5 years of research, which was a great privilege that maybe we can talk about a little bit if we get to talk about methods, because it is also about access. Show me the work you did, I'll show you what kind of funding you had, what passports you have, and what kind of access to space you had. They're not, what we do is highly structured by what precedes what we do. Anyway, for example, I think of it as a kind of a transnational framework that for understanding the relationships between sovereignty, secularism, and the state. And it's transnational in the sense that it's concerned with kind of two frameworks that nation states share regardless of their location or regime type. And that is sort of two binary mythologies, one between the secular and the religious, and the other between the public and private sphere. And by focusing on those two sort of binaries, I think it does allow us to think very broadly about this fundamental relationship between sexual and political difference. For example, sectarianism could be used to think about the regulation of the body and resistance to that regulation, which is something that we see across the world today. And I think it's an interesting question when we think of is this theory, or does theory travel, or is it something that's already in some ways traveling? And here, sometimes after you write a book, you keep thinking about it. And I think we live in a world that's really increasingly sectarian, whether it's, within nation states, sectarian approaches to political difference, political parties between nation states and transnationally. And you can see discourses and practices of sexual difference really kind of defining these highly sectarian kinds of difference. And I think that Lebanon is a really interesting place to think about this, because it's not, in many ways, when we think about Lebanon, we think about it through a framework of exceptionalism. But in fact, it's kind of paradigmatic, or it's kind of an intensification of something global, which people have been writing about for decades now, which is the relationship between sexual and political difference. And that's kind of how I see the relationships between these different scales of work. And here, I would say that Lebanon is a very generative place for a theory like Sextarianism that describes something very global.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, I there's I was going to bring this up later, but it's perfectly timed here, is that you have a line in your book where you say this is not a particularly Lebanese story, right? And I think at some level, like, that captures a lot of what you were just saying in terms of how Lebanon can be generative, how places, right, that a lot of people don't think of as being in the global South can generate theory, which is in part, I think, what one of the major contributions of this book does. But this is really, yeah, this is really excellent. Can you talk a little bit about the different bodies of literature that that your book is in conversation with, and how you decided how to be in conversation with these literatures?
I think, the book has really changed as my interests have changed, and even as my sort of location has shifted. So it started off, or my dissertation became kind of an archive for the book. And my dissertation was in a discipline, anthropology, and then my first job was in a Middle East Studies department, and I now work in a gender studies department. So, the book, as I kept reading and learning from colleagues, and with both my faculty colleagues and graduate students, and being exposed to new literatures and new ways of thinking about questions that have always concerned me. And Bassam mentioned one. He was my professor because my MA is in politics, of the concentration of politics from Georgetown. So I've always had this like very weird interest in the state, like kind of a fixated interest in the state and state power. But then as I moved through these different fields, this is where all these different literatures started to come in and speak together. And that is very much, I think, the privilege of being exposed to different literatures, different people, and different groups of colleagues. So I guess in anthropology, right, I had started off with this question, which is still a big question in the field of anthropology, which is sort of the religious and the secular. That's where I had started. And that was kind of the grounding of this project. And as I moved through and I started to do my research, it started to shift. And then I started, really, when I was working at NYU, thinking heavily about the state and state theory, and the state as it relates to the Middle East, and the state as it relates to queer theory. And here I think even, the work I was doing at Jadalia really bled into my interest here. And the book started to take a very clear direction into feminist theory, queer theory, and sexuality studies. And this only intensified as I started a job in gender studies. So that's kind of how these literatures came together. Literatures on the state, on secularism, religion, gender, and sexuality. And in some ways, it's like, show me what you're writing and I'll tell you what you've been reading. And that's kind of what I've been reading for these, decades now. Jesus, yeah, decades.
Thank you. Thanks, Maya. Nadia, I'll take this one.
Yes, please.
So the book is fascinating, and I must admit I am not completely finished with it, but all the chapters that I've read are definitely going to make their way into my next course, the graduate course on survey of the politics and societies of the Middle East, which I also recommend for anybody teaching any survey course, let alone a course that deals more directly with the topics that you address, Maya. Maya, an essential part of your book, of the story that you tell, particularly thinking about the chapters on the 1932 consensus and conversion, religious conversion, is that sectarianism offers us a new way of looking at both state and sovereignty, state in Lebanon, as well as sovereignty. Can you tell us a little bit about how you think about the state and in relation sovereignty? We are now, interestingly, just last week, we just had our discussion of the theories of the state, and that reading for me was actually pretty interesting. We'd like to know your take on this based on the chapters that I mentioned.
Sure. I think you mean the 1932 census.
Definitely wasn't a consensus.
Which, I mean, I guess sometimes is seen as kind of the fountainhead of consociational democracy, in square quotes, consociational democracy in Lebanon. But for me, I was interested actually in this question that has become kind of a lacuna and has almost become like an impulse. Like, وين الدولة? Where is the state? And there's this kind of assumption. And I say it's a compulsion because it's something that has been asked so many times, and it keeps getting asked, and people have been working on this and offering answers or more refined questions, and the question keeps getting asked. So I was thinking similarly around that question, and I was also really sort of invested. And here you have, I think it matters, who the person is who's doing any kind of research, and living through the experience of war, living through the experience of being considered a failed state, going to Iraq and seeing the stakes of what this discourse of failed state are. And the stakes are very dramatic for people, and can it literally mean life and death. So I was very interested in this question of what is the state, what does sovereignty look like, and if we, instead of asking where the sovereignty is or where the state is, I wanted to instead say, okay, what is the state doing? How is sovereignty actually being expressed? How does the state talk about its own sovereignty? And I think here, and in those specific chapters, and I'll talk about a later one last, the introduction is really kind of wrapped around the 1932 census, which is really like a fountainhead, right, of the story about Lebanon, both historically and politically. And here I had access to a case file from the Court of Cassation, actually to be more specific, from the Plenary Assembly at the Court of Cassation, that revolved around the census and was really kind of 100 years of evidence about where the census played a key role, but the census was not the heart of the story. The census was used as evidence, and as evidence, it got mobilized as truth and as non-truth at the same time. And that sort of contradiction became very interesting to me, and it led to thinking about the relationship between things like lies and bureaucracy, truth and power, and ultimately this sort of shadow story that accompanies the census, which is the story of sexual difference and how key it was to the very founding of the state and its reverberations to the present, the practices of the state to the present. The chapter on religious conversion kind of stages. So there, I think, what I'm trying to say is that chapter really takes on sovereignty in a kind of biopolitical sense, a legal sense, and stages sort of the historical context of the book. The chapter on religious conversion was is making the point that a lot of these religious conversions, or at least the ones that I was privy to through this court and through its archive, were really fundamentally about converting between different regimes of sexual difference, different kinship rights that were enshrined in these different laws. And the state's role, and the state takes this role very seriously, was in determining the boundaries and the sovereignty of personal status law, the borders of that jurisdiction. And by doing that, the state really posed itself and staged its own sovereignty as the ability to limit and to rule between and ultimately to transcend these units of difference into sort of one larger overarching structure called the state and called the sovereignty of the state. And then actually in the final chapter, and I think this is a chapter that was really comes out of thinking more seriously through literature on gender, sexuality, and the experience of the state itself. I wanted to take on this relationship of violence and sovereignty, because there is a story that is often told about Lebanon and the fact that the state needs to be stronger. We need to have a stronger state. And the reason is because the state does not control the means of violence. And that relies on a very, I would say, like, it's a theory of sovereignty that has been very influential about the hegemony over the use of violence, and it has really animated a lot of political debate around the world, and increasingly so in Lebanon. And my take on it was, and this came out of my research, was to say, well, okay, just because the state doesn't control or have hegemony over the means of violence doesn't mean that it's not violent, doesn't mean that it doesn't practice violence, and doesn't mean that it's not extremely protective over its use of violence. And the question then becomes, when you look at where the state is practicing this sovereign violence, you see it's highly carceral, violent, and very, very strong concern with vulnerable populations. So then if you were to put yourself in the position of being in those vulnerable populations, whether they're migrant labor, refugees, queer people, people living with drug addictions, or the incarcerated, what would that call for more state power sound like from that site? So if you were standing in that position, and what would the implications of calling for a stronger state be? And there I try to rethink the relationship of the Lebanese state to sovereignty through violence on vulnerable people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this is where you also offer some really interesting explorations of the difference between sort of citizen and refugee, right, as well. Yeah. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I just, because I think it's really
ahead.
important, even when we think about theories of sovereignty, especially as they relate to Lebanon and the Middle East and, the places that occupy us and concern us, is that these are highly, I don't want to use the word diverse because it has a lot of, I think, ideology to it. Like societies that have many, many multiple forms of political difference within them. They're very, there's kind of modular forms of political difference within one political society. So I also wanted to think of a way to think of the state and to think of sovereignty, not only wrapped up in the question of citizenship, but actually to find a way to think about political society as it is reflected and as it is lived in Lebanon, where citizens are, just 1 out of every 4 people, or 1 out of every 3.5 people who live in Lebanon is not a citizen. So you can't really write about the state or about citizenship without taking into account how it's a highly securitized, disciplinary, and hierarchical relationship to political society.
And this is a great sort of segue into the next question that I wanted to pose, which is how a major kind of a backbone, right, the central axis of your work is the law and the courts in Lebanon, in particular, of course, the Court of Cassation, the highest civil court in the country. And you've taken it up in ways I think that nobody else really has, especially in conversations and discussions of Lebanon. So can you talk about sort of, how you came to sort of center this court, the significance that you see for centering sort of law on the sort of on sectarianism and its components, I guess, how you think about it in relation in particular to personal status and the secular, and based on conversations you and I've had, right, how this relates to, thinking about personal status in the context of political economy.
Mm. Well, a very small
Just
question.
a small question. Yes, I know. Exactly. Yeah.
At least you did not say consensus instead of census.
يا ريت قالت consensus.
I'm so consensus oriented. And the reason I'm saying this is that I was on mute and I was trying to say something, and then I realized I was on mute after that boo-boo.
Well, I mean, actually, it's funny, right? Because the access I had to the Court of Cassation and to the Plenary Assembly, and it's a story I tell in the book of how I got access to this. But the story that I just realized I don't tell is why I actually went to that court to begin with. And that is that, as I said, at first I was really interested in religion and the secular as it relates to religious conversion. So my image of what I was going to do, or what I thought I was going to do when I started doing my research, was I thought I would go around to different personal status courts and ask them about religious conversion and sort of be given access to their archives. And then, of course, as I started to do that, I realized that whatever access I was being given and not given was very much about who I was in Lebanon, what my sect is, what my religion is, what my gender is. So that kind of became, and I didn't want to write a project about specific sects, like conversion within specific sects. And then I was very happily, because I was at the Adliya, I was at the ministry, the courthouse, the Beirut courthouse a lot during this time. And I started working in the Cassation Court and the Plenary Assembly. And the Plenary Assembly is really the highest court in Lebanon, other than the Constitutional Court. But citizens don't have access to the Constitutional Court. So it's the highest one for ordinary citizens. And what this court does is it settles disputes, like almost any Cassation or high court, right? It settles disputes. Its decisions cannot be appealed. And it also deals with questions that have sort of jurisprudential implications on jurisprudence. As a side note, this is the court that's now been totally immobilized over the question of the Beirut port explosion. So it's not functioning now. And we can talk about that later. But anyway, so being given access to this court, and, because it is a high court, for anyone who's interested in law, no case reaches any high court in any country, unless it's incredibly complicated. Like they have to be sort of complicated cases to reach that level of the legal system, and for these courts to agree to hear these cases. So that meant that having access to this court and how it deals with religious conversion, and a big chunk of its jurisprudence is about religious conversion, allowed me a state-centric view of this process, allowed me to kind of actually look at how all these different personal status courts are integrated into a legal system, and how this court, the Cassation Court, mediates between them and really sort of structures its work as that space of transcendence. But of course, these are all operating within regimes of sexual difference. So even sort of if the right to a different personal status court and to religious difference is wrapped up in the right to a specific regime of sexual difference, the transcendence of that regime is still into a system of sexual difference. It's just the sovereign unitary one of sexual difference of the state itself, of that space of the state. So definitely, I forgot even what the question was, but
No, just to ask you to reflect on kind of the central role that the law takes in studying this particular topic, and how you came to sort of see that, which you're partly doing, and also thinking about, the how you sort of were relating personal status to this question of the secular and the context of sectarianism as it plays out in the country. And then I added, based on conversations you and I have had, elsewhere, which is the ways in which you have come to see personal status through the sort of the lens of political economy, the sort of central role that it plays in that regard. You can pick and choose any of those to respond to, if you want.
I mean, I think I've always been interested in law. And in some ways, it's kind of the career I didn't have that I probably would have found very interesting. So I've always been interested in law, and I've also been interested in the way that law gets talked about, and the way that law doesn't get talked about, and the way that law is assumed to, and the sort of the ideological force that law has, right? Like sort of the original legal fiction, law is because law is, law matters because it matters. And then what happens if law doesn't matter because it doesn't matter? So I've always been interested in that moment. And I wanted to also, when I was starting research, I wanted to research something that I didn't know about. Because when I started graduate school, and Bassam knows this, I didn't want to work on Lebanon. So one of the ways that I came to working on Lebanon was saying, okay, I want to work on something that I don't know anything about. Which is how I became really interested in law. And what perspective I think law gives you is that you see a whole area of expertise, a highly bureaucratic legal state, and you see an arena of expertise, publishing, scholarship, and a kind of legal history that I don't think has been that is very fascinating. And I remember like one of the first times that I went to the legal library and I was reading some like legal periodicals, and the further back you go, the languages change, the countries change, like where precedent in Lebanese law comes from. And I became really this kind of fascinated with the law and with the assumption that law doesn't exist, or the assumption that law doesn't work the same way. And of course now law is not working at all because there is a big strike happening. And courts are not being held, and cases are not being heard, and people are not even being allowed out of prison because judges aren't signing those warrants to let them out. But so I was very interested in that question. And I think personal status, part of that is the story of personal status and how it gets talked about is really highly wrapped up in the question of gender and the question of sectarianism itself. And here, sectarianism and its kind of religious register. And what I started to see when I was doing my research is how personal status law is actually a critical component of state law, how it's integrated into the state, and how it's really foundational and critically important to the unitary nature of the state, to staging that state effect, right? As Timothy Mitchell calls it. And I wanted to write about personal status law, but bring it into this conversation also and present it as kind of a really fundamental site of the production of biopolitical difference. And part of that is through property, and the role of personal status law has in the management of property, and that property's relationship with gender. So a lot of the conversions that I was seeing were about inheritance, for example. They were about the transfer of property in different sects that have different gendered roles over inheritance. So that's kind of how I became interested in that. And once you start looking at the trace between these different areas of law, you really can't get away from bureaucracy. And you really start to see how highly bureaucratic the state is. Even if it's, on a piece of paper in a big ledger that's like this big, it's still highly bureaucratic, and it functions through those different, I think, constitutive points of bureaucracy.
Yeah. That raises another question. I don't know. Do you want to take this one, Bassam? We can't hear you.
I'm actually interested in this myself, as well as many other researchers and students, and that is Maya. In your book, you, I think one of the key things, and I've seen this throughout your work for the past, I don't know, should we say 20
Long.
years? The past 75 years. No, for the past 20. Yeah, there was a consensus all around. خلاص بس. So a key component of your book, Naya, I'm dreaming of Naya. Maya, sorry. A key component of your book, and the key contribution of your book, is how you were able to bring together a number of methodological approaches in basically the way you produced your work. And it's something that so many of us, researchers, scholars, students, what have you, would like to do in a productive and regenerative way, and in a way that doesn't slip into methodological muddle, right? Can you tell us a little bit about how you navigated that, and maybe a little bit about your process, because there must have been a point where you decided, this is how I can move forward with this sort of these multiple methodologies, and what is it that you were worried about, and how you avoided lack of methodological clarity, which your book actually speaks to the opposite of. So if you can just tell us a little bit about this process, that would be great.
Sure.
And this would be great to bring up what you were mentioning earlier, Maya, which is how questions of access, right? Like how are determined, and on the ground, but also in terms of the kinds of support that we get,
Mhm.
or don't.
Yeah, or don't get.
Yeah, or don't.
Yeah. So like the methods that I use in the book are archival and ethnographic. And that's kind of a good pairing, a well-traveled pairing that a lot of scholars have used together. I think here the key to this kind of methodological, and I tried to use it in a kind of interdisciplinary way, and that's something that I learned again from where I teach currently, which is to try to have a way to use multiple methods in ways that speak to each other, interrogate each other, where the methods themselves are used to kind of interrogate the limits, boundaries, and possibilities of each other. So it's not just, like, here's my ethnography chapter, here's my archival chapter, this is this is that. But when you really have both of these methods living convivially, what happens? And here, again, I think it's important to talk about access, because I was really very privileged in many ways doing this research, because I had grants, research grants, and research grants that meant that I was living actually at a standard of living in Beirut that was high. And what I mean by that was solidly middle to upper middle class for a single person living in Beirut. And that's something that has to do with kind of just global economic structures and transitions. So I was financially comfortable doing my research. I had a lot of time. I had 2 passports, which allowed me to go back and forth. I had my own networks to rely on, whether they were networks of friendship, intimacy, activism. And all of that played a role in how I was able to work methodologically through my project. Just because I think methods oftentimes require a lot of dwelling, and dwelling is really a privilege, and it's not something that just comes out of like a fountainhead, right? It comes out of structures, and structures that are highly unequal to access. So how I was given access to the High Court, for example, to the Court of Cassation and its archives, kind of tells this story in 2 registers, because I met someone very high up in the Lebanese judiciary. He's now retired. And he's on TV all the time, but he's now retired. He really had a very, very high position at the time that I met him. And I met him in the United States at a seminar at the law school where I went to grad school at Columbia University. And he was there talking about Solidaire, in which he played a very central role, sort of setting up the legal framework of it. And in the Q&A session, I asked him a question, that was about how he could kind of justify like massive land grabs and theft, basically, like organized legal theft at a time after the Civil War where people had already been sort of decimated. And we got into an argument, and then that argument became a friendship, or became, and part of that was mediated by a professor in the law school that I was taking a course with. So we all went out after that talk. And then when he said, what are you working on? And I told him, and he said, when you come to Lebanon, just give me a call. Call me and come see me at the Adliye, at the Ministry of Justice / courthouse. So I said, okay, I will. And I did. And I would go there and drink coffee with him, and we would talk about different, and at the time, like the STL was a big thing, the Special Tribunal in Lebanon, which he was also a part of. And I got into some really interesting conversations with him, and I saw some interesting things just by hanging out with him there. And then he said, why don't you go down to the Cassation Court archive and tell them, just go down and tell them that I sent you, because I had said, I need like a paper, I need access. And he said, we don't have that kind of law here, like a public records law. So go down to the archive, see what happens. So I said, okay. I went down to the archive. It was like a floor below. And I said, hi, this is who I am. This is what I want to study. And it turned out that the actual archivist of the Hay al-Ammi, the Plenary Assembly, she turned out to be my aunt's neighbor in the area that I grew up in Beirut. So those are kind of 2 structuring encounters, I would say, that offered me access, but also made it impossible to not think ethnographically about the archive, because they were such different, like very, very powerful figures, both of them. One is the archivist of the highest court, and one was like in charge of a whole regulatory branch of the legal system. But they could not be different in terms of compensation, in terms of what their working days looked like, what their social worlds looked like, and my own connection to them, how they looked like. One was kind of mediated through these like Ivy League networking or networks. And he had also taught at Ivy League schools, and he was very proud of that. And he would talk about that a lot. And the other was mediated by my aunt's neighbor, who, when we talked, would tell me about how my aunt, when she was sick, would like send her food, and those kinds of relationships. In Tariq Jdide, which is classed in a kind of different way. So it became impossible not to write ethnographically after having like that being my introduction to kind of archival research. So I
Naya,
wanted to.
Maya, did you just have to plug in Tariq Jdide? Since you and
Um,
I say it like every once in a while when we talk, did you just have to find a way to plug it in?
Jay. Uh, uh,
TJ.
أطيب hamburger, man. No, it's actually a part of this chapter, Bassam, because it is. I talk about how it's thought of as a social space, and the way that it really, in some ways, is a story about Lebanon that is very much about also like sectarian and sextarian stereotyping, and the assumptions that people make of you when they know where you're from any particular place in Lebanon. Right. And Nadia and I have talked about this a lot too. That it's not as if, you walk around Lebanon as this like neutral Lebanese citizen subject. Right? Like you're very quickly placed into a highly structured, almost rhizome of positionality as you walk around, and just, live your life. So I've mentioned it because it's actually part of that chapter. Um, And then because a lot of the activists I was working with were lawyers and were activists in law, and a lot of the people who wanted to build a secular sect, or what they called a secular sect, they had a very, they were also very obsessed, very interested in law. So that became, even I would discuss like court cases with them, and they would know what I was talking about, or legal processes. And that was a way to really bring the archival again and the ethnographic together. I had a practice where, with one of my friends, who was an activist, we would read court cases together. And that's what we would do. And that became another way to think ethnographically and archivally together. So I do use multiple methods. I think it's I'm not sure. Yeah. So what I would say for people who want to do who and I think you're right. I see it a lot where I work. People do use multiple methods. I would say take each one very seriously in its own form, but also allow each method to really expose the other's lack or the other's limit, and then live in that limit. Try to write within that limit.
I mean, so this is amazing because I mean, one of my favorite chapters, I think, in your book is the chapter "A Fire in the Archive," which is, I think, where you bring, it's like, I think it's, I mean, you obviously, it diffuses your whole book, the sort of bringing the ethnographic and the archival together clearly. But I think there's a way in which, in that chapter, that you bring it together, these two methods together in particular, in like really very generative ways. And also, there's one of the reasons why I love this chapter so much is the sort of keen sensitivity with which you write about the issues that you're talking about in that chapter, and also the people that you encounter, right? So you're thinking in that chapter, you kind of reflect critically on the archive as a curated space, right? As well as on the content in the archive, the specific documents, the cases that you read and that you discuss in that chapter. And you also do so in part against the backdrop of this fire, of this 1985 fire. And so can we sort of segue or sort of continue the conversation of multiple methodologies as it pertains to this chapter and talk about how you think about archives, the archive, and archivists, which I think is a beautiful part of this particular chapter. as a central, and the central role that all of these play in your book as part of the, story, but also methodologically, like how you sort of think about all of them
Mm.
in the ethnography and the history that you're relaying.
Sure. I mean, I think part of because I was interested in different things and what I ended up writing about. So part of what happened was I would go to this archive, and I really, I went to, like, I sat in, took law classes, sat in on different law classes at the Lebanese University, spoke to professors a lot because I didn't know much about the law. Went to all the legal libraries, spoke to librarians, and so what I would do is when I would talk to archivists, I would say, well, what do you think is important? Like, you tell me what you think is important to think about when it comes to sovereignty. Like, what case for you is important here? Um, and a lot of the cases that they shared with me ended up really being the bulk, or a big chunk of the book. Um, One of them is the introduction chapter, right? Samara's story, this very dramatic narrative arc of 100 years, which again just sort of shows that the story we hear about the census, there's so many stories there. So in the census itself, so the story of Samara ends up actually being about personal status, about a woman needing a divorce and not being able to afford a divorce. So the census offers a totally new, it not only remakes new states, it makes lives. It has the capacity to remake life, to start life anew, and to start life anew as someone who had never been married. But then the sort of afterlives of the census are highly structural in terms of the Lebanese state. And they're also structural on a smaller scale, which is the scale of a family living through the legal consequences of that lie that became a bureaucratic truth over 3 generations. So I didn't have because I was interested in religious conversion, again, I wouldn't have looked at that case. I wouldn't have found it if I hadn't said, what do you think I should see? What do you think, like, you've been doing this for decades. What do you think is important? And I was shown this case, and then I was shown this case both because of its dramatic narrative arc, but equally important because it had burned in the 1985 fire. So they had to, like, redo the file itself, and they would told me about how, like, some of the pages were burnt and they had to redo this and they had to redo that. So there was also a highly material and tactile, I think, relationship to the archive that the fire allowed, and that the fire at least drew attention to. So from there, and I try to build this argument in the book that the relationship of research is not extractive, it's highly collaborative. And, we might be important narrators of the books we write, but we're not necessarily the only authors of this knowledge production. I think we have a lot of co-authors. I think archivists and their work is, like, our work is impossible without their work. And especially in an archival context like that, where archivists are literally, pulling burning files out of a fire with their bare hands, or they're working in a room without a light bulb, and they're, falling out of an attic and breaking their arms trying to access a file from 1920, right, which has been put up in some inaccessible place. They embody a history that has yet to be written. They embody, in many ways, the history and the living structure and the living memory of the state. And I try to give that its due, and also to kind of use that lived space as the archive to speak back in some ways, in terms of to some of the grand theories that have been written about the archive. So what I mean by that is, that we have a lot of grand narratives about the archive, a grand theoretical narratives, right? If you think of the Foucauldian narrative, the archaeology of knowledge, if you think about the Derridian narrative, archive fever. And I've personally been highly influenced by Carolyn Steedman, who's like, these narratives are all great and good, but let's think about the materiality of what it's actually like to live a life in the archive. And there you see, things like archive fever are not a metaphor, but they're actually a practice. They're people running into a fire, burning themselves, in pain, living the war in this archive. Imagine going to work every day during a war to hear court cases. Imagine going to the court during a war to get, to prosecute a murder case in the middle of a civil war. What does all of this denote? And I try to bring all of this together, or think about at least these things in that chapter that you're talking about, and really reframe the question of authorship in some ways, of academic knowledge. And I think of this as a kind of feminist praxis also, because I think we all know it's true of the work we do. We just don't really write about it often.
Thanks, Maya. I just want to say one thing about audience questions. We have gone longer than we told Maya, a little bit longer, but that's okay. If you have any questions, if anybody watching has any questions, you can just add them to the Facebook feed. This happened again today, as it did yesterday with our event. For some reason, people are sending me personally questions, which I will share with Maya. But if you have any questions, please add them to the Facebook feed. All right. Nadia, do you have another question before we
I
wrap
have
up?
one more if we can.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is it kind of picks up on some of what Maya was just talking about, but also, conversations that I think we've all had, both with each other, but also with others, which is, Maya, in the course of the conversation of the last question specifically, but this whole conversation that we've had since we started, I mean, we've mentioned, civil war, particular kind of the hazards of working in an archive, crossing, checkpoints. You mentioned, the discussion of how the court of Cassatian is not really functioning at this point due to, controversies and pushback around the port explosion. So I bring these up because this really leads to, I would really like actually to use this space to ask you to talk about something that you and I have discussed at different points, and that you do talk about at different places. Like there's a conversation that you're having in this book in different places, which is what it's been like and what it is like to think and write and publish academically on Lebanon in the midst of and in the wake of the last 3 years. And not just the last 3 years, obviously not exclusively, but, in particular, given, the sort of series of events, I guess. So can you talk a little bit more about what that has been like for you around this work, what it's prompted you to consider? And the first line, if I can just add, like the first line in your book, and you mentioned this a little bit earlier, is that you say this ethnography of Lebanon began in Iraq, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I'm definitely not trying to exceptionalize the sort of experience of thinking, writing, publishing academically on Lebanon as just being about Lebanon. Unfortunately, it is, far more pervasive on this planet, especially these days. But so I think that this is, if you can share a little bit about, yeah, the sort of angst. I don't know. I'm not sure what word to use, but yeah, how is it, I think, and you and I have said this, like, it's important to utter this, I think, right, and not to just sit with it in our heads, or in the experience of when we're thinking and writing, and ultimately publishing, like, the sort of raising the questions of, like, the purpose of what we're doing, right, not to get
Yeah.
too existential, but at some level, yeah. um
Like, what's the point?
so I wanted to, yeah, without getting too nihilistic, but yeah. Because I think this, especially the last, couple of years, again, on Lebanon, but not only on Lebanon, this is something that I think a lot of people are grappling with. And so I'd like to,
Mm.
open space here to have you sort of reflect on this to the whatever extent you would like to do so.
I think that it is, or at least it was for me, very hard pulling this book to a close and moving it through the stages it had to go through, and then publishing it, having it be published in this last year. The book came out in July, I think. I think it was July, either June or July. And which means, right, given academic production, that it had kind of been in the pipeline for about 10 months to, right, or a total of like a year and a half before that. And I think I remember I got the readers' reviews maybe a couple days after the Beirut port explosion. It was something really crazy like that. And I think it's really hard to, and I think it's good to ask yourself these questions. And I think a lot of us, a lot of great work has really come out in the last few years on Lebanon, and will continue to come out. And it has been difficult to push through and to really think, like, what are you doing? What is the point of doing this, right? Especially if you think, who do you want to read your work? How accessible is it? I keep going back to, like, the Lebanese University, which was really critical. The law school at the Lebanese University was really critical to my research, both in terms of just a research space, but and professors in the law school, professors who teach at the law school there, and students, lawyers who were trained there, the Lebanese University. So I sometimes think, what does it mean that, like, your book costs whatever it costs, and the salary of a professor at the law school at the Lebanese University is like $100, or the equivalent of $100 a month, right? What do we do with that kind of? And I don't mean it like, what do we do? I mean, like, actually, what is that index, right? What is that kind of, what is that relation of knowledge and circulation and extraction? What does that look like? What does that feel like? And I take, and I really talk to my friends a lot about this, because it was difficult. And in some ways, I one of the ways that I personally cope with these things is to write in different genres. So I think of academic writing as like one genre of many. So it's useful to write about the same thing in different genres. And that really helped me, I think, actually write in this academic genre, was to have a different way of writing about what was happening, and what it was like, what the last 3 years have been like, also through this relation of being there and being away, being there and being away. I think it's useful to remember here, again, right, Lebanon is not exceptional, and we can take power and inspiration and And to me, that was also, I think, really important to say in the book, that there's a kind of the real tragedy about the story about Lebanon is that it's not exceptional. That's actually what's really sad about it, is that huge chunk of the world lives through a similar relation to violence at multiple scales, and to destruction and inequality and all these things. If anything, the attention given to Lebanon can be a little exceptional. But I think there's something here that's important to remember, and that certainly helped me to remember that, when I went down to write my dissertation, and then after the dissertation, I had to rewrite it because of another exceptional thing that had happened, which was the war in Syria and the massive movement of Syrian refugees into Lebanon. And I had to take, and you can't write about citizenship in the same way in the wake of Syria and Lebanon. So that was a moment that I also had to sit down and rethink and what I was writing, and try to come up with a framework that could speak to this kind of political society. So I think it's useful sometimes to remember that, like, the moment we're living in is exceptionally awful. But awful moments are not exceptional in the history of Lebanon and in the history of just life, right, of the world. And I find that kind of usefully sad, but useful in some ways.
On
Like,
that note,
Usefully sad. That's thank you. Thanks. It's really thoughtful. Thanks, Maya.
thank you very much, Maya. We reached the 75-minute limit that we had discussed, but I have at least one question. The other one is a comment. The other ones are comments. People have texted me personally again, saying that they are really enjoying this conversation. And one person asked, what is it that you are planning next? And they wanted to know, why did you write this particular book, which brings together all these different dimensions, considering that this person somehow wants to know that you didn't focus specifically on gender and sexuality, and what is it that might come next, and why is it that you wrote this particular book, which is pretty hefty in terms of its focal point, and also she loved. Oh, sorry, I'm not supposed to say. For some reason, they said they loved your discussion of the book.
Why did I write the book? Because I needed to write a book to get tenure.
Wait,
These are like some of the kind of structural things you have to move through. Really, I think sometimes, that was really useful. Also, I had a friend, I work with one of my closest friends. So I was like, I want to write this book. Oh my God, this book is it's too much. I'm never going to finish. And she would always say, it's just like, you just need to get it out to get tenure. Like, that's what it's about. That's why you need to publish this. Like, just try to break it down, put it into smaller increments, right? And it was really helpful because, sometimes these things can get really big in our heads. And they are huge. It's like a mountain on your back, but you have to, it's useful to cut things down and put them in perspective. So I wrote this book for those reasons, but also because at a certain point, you just have to sit down and write it. Yeah.
And what's next?
Well, I have two projects that are
And
next.
I wanted to ask the same question. What's next? Because I I know that you have a lot more projects in mind, so would love to know what's on the horizon, and whether it will connect with this work in any way, shape, or form.
Mhm. Well, I have sort of two projects that I'm doing now that I'm really excited about. So one of which is kind of built off of this work, built off of this book, and is taken still from court cases, high court cases. And they are 5 different court cases that really index, I think, important historical moments in Lebanon and in the region more generally. So it's sort of a book that traces a sectarian kind of historical present through 5 pivotal court cases taken from different eras. The Mandate era, the post-independence era, the war, the Civil War era, the Ta'if era, and then today. That's kind of the structure of the book. And I'm actually presenting on parts of it soon, so I'm excited about it. And then the other one is actually about it's related. It's still an archival project, an archival and ethnographic project, and it's actually about the it's more related to a kind of family history. A few years ago, my mom forwarded me an email that was, and she said, "This is my great great aunt's story." So I opened it, and it was like a short story that had been downloaded from Ancestry.com. And it was a sort of abbreviated story of this Ojibwe woman living in the late 19th century in the Midwest, in the upper Midwest around Lake Superior. And I got really interested, like, how did this story, who's written by one of my ancestors, how the hell did it get to Ancestry.com? So I started doing some research on it, and it turned out that this woman, Eliza Morrison, had written an autobiography in the 19th century at the kind of urging of her employer at the time, right before she moved to the reservation that now my mom has a house on and is enrolled in this tribe and everything, which is the Bad River Band of Lake Superior Chippewa Indians on the Bad River Reservation in Wisconsin. So right before she moved here to that, she wrote this autobiography. And then the letters that she wrote to her employer have been published 5 times in 5 different iterations, 2 academic books and sort of 1 library imprint, and then in different kind of iterations, like in someone else's autobiography, in a newspaper at the time, took and called them like campfire stories and published them that way. So I became really fascinated both with this woman and with all of the like hyper visibility around this woman and her letters and the knowledge production around her story and her autobiography. So I've started doing research there. I've found where they're archived, how they're archived, and that will eventually also be, I don't know what genre it'll become. Right now it's a book, and it's a, how this relates to the first project in some ways is that they're kind of contemporary moments. Like I have a case file that I'm working from the Mandate era in Lebanon, which is 1919, like the cases in 1919. Eliza Morrison moves on to the reservation, also around like I think 5 years prior. So these are contemporary historical moments, but they're really rarely thought of as contemporary moments and struggles and figures. So part of what I want to do in this second project on Eliza Morrison is to think about how the United States is constructed, how the temporality of the United States is constructed in Middle East studies. So how the Middle East studies story of America, of the United States, partakes in a kind of settler colonial temporality, kind of achieves the United States before it's achieved in some ways. So I'm kind of interested in those.
Maya, why do you hate America? No. Okay. So,
On that note, bye-bye.
Nadia and I were speaking about how Eddie Murphy closed his.
Yeah, we're not going to say that.
Yeah, we're not going to say that. That's fascinating, Maya. I mean,
but I was thinking about why I hate America. لا بحكي about this like anti-imperialism, anti-authoritarianism, anti-imperialism, kind of silly binary. And I think actually like focusing on something like sectarianism can help us get out of this binary. Like, because both sides of the binary are highly interested and highly focused.
Absolutely. Maya's referring to a project we're working on, but so far it's been behind closed doors. It's a workshop on, or a project actually, on navigating anti-imperialism and anti-authoritarianism. Basically, what would you do when a democratic movement or a movement for democracy within an authoritarian, and everything's in quotation marks here, including democracy and authoritarianism. What would you do when a democratic or movement for democracy in an authoritarian setting is supported by imperialist power, and how do you navigate where to stand, which is something that we saw during some of the cases included in the Arab uprisings recently, as well as what's happening in Iran in general, U.S., Iran, and so on. But thank you, Maya.
Why do you hate democracy?
Sorry?
Why do you hate democracy?
I mean, we're not supposed to use the word hate, Maya, anymore. So I would like to
Who told you that?
I've been wanting to say that this is fascinating what you have been sharing in terms of the new research that you addressed. This is really, wow. This is really powerful to move in this direction, and I'm sure the person who asked and myself and many others would love to look out for what you'll be producing. And before I actually have a couple of things, but I'm gonna hold off because I can ask these questions to you in person. I wanted to see if Nadia has anything else to share, so that we could probably close at 90 minutes, which is in about 60 seconds.
I just wanted to thank Maya for, as always, being so thoughtful and both concise and also expansive in her answers. Like, she covers a lot with very little prompts. And for everyone who has not yet read this book, run out and get it. It will change the way that you think about Lebanon, but also about so many other things. And also, to go back to your two future projects that you mentioned, I think it's great that this was asked, because one of the things that is so interesting is that it's very clear the ways in which the sort of themes and the interests that come up in this book are continued in these two very different projects, but also that are not so different, right? That there's a lot of continuity in terms of the way that you're thinking about a lot of these topics. So yeah, so I'll just echo Bassam and say I can't wait for these future projects to come out, and I can't wait for all the three of us to be in the same room together at some point.
Yeah.
Again,
Absolutely.
It's been too long.
It has been too long.
Absolutely, and Mesa can be that place. Before we close, I would like thank you so much, Maya. I really appreciate your everything. So thank you so much for being
Thank
here. Thank you for writing this book. Thank you for illuminating us and expanding our horizons, and for being a leading light for so many people that I know are always looking to what you're going to do next. And I will be very excited to assign the work you've done in this book in my future courses. I know that many will as well. And thank you, Nadia, for being the most awesome co-host who is far more knowledgeable than I am on this topic, and helped bring this discussion to a more refined level. And thanks to all of us who joined us. This was a co-sponsored event by the Middle East and Islamic Studies program, and the Shar School, and the Global Islamic Studies Center at George Mason University, and of the Arab Studies Institute. Before we leave, I just want to say that next week on Tuesday at 6 p.m. we are holding an event. We are hosting Jillian Schwedler, who will be talking about protesting Jordan, and I will show the flyer right now.
Great book.
This is, wait a minute. Okay, there we go. So we don't have any distractions. This is going to happen next week on Tuesday again at 6 p.m. And we are very excited about this because we also will be broadcasting this either live or immediately after. Jillian will come to us from New York, and the title of her talk will be Protesting Jordan, Geographies of Power and Dissent. She will be at George Mason University, and we are absolutely thrilled to have her join us. And with that, I would like to thank again our speaker, awesome author and person, Maya Mikdashi, and my co-host and co-moderator, Nadia Sbeiti. Thank you all for watching. And as I keep saying, let's keep it moving. We all have a lot of work to do.
Thanks for being you, Bassam. Thank you
Also go to the
for
beach
being an
for
awesome co-host.
yeah.
Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you. Thank you both.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for watching.
It's nice to it's nice and kind of odd, right, to like talk to your very close friends about like something you did
In this professional way.
Yeah, I know. You're like, no.
Without using curse words.
Exactly. Like I was watching my language. But yeah. Thank you. And thanks for everyone who came and listened and shared their thoughts.
Assalamu alaikum.
Merci كتير.
Bye, guys.
Are we still there?
Yes, we are.